The photograph was taken in 1952. The pilot was debriefed for 6 hours. The film was confiscated, and the official explanation didn't come for another 30 years. By the end of this, you'll know exactly what that pilot saw, why 3 separate government agencies scrambled to contain it, and why the explanation they finally gave raises more questions than it answers. His name was Captain Jack Adams. Decorated Korean War veteran. 41 confirmed reconnaissance missions. The kind of pilot the Air Force trusted with equipment that didn't officially exist and routes that weren't on any map. In the summer of 1952, Adams was assigned to a routine high-altitude survey flight over the southwestern United States. Routine. That word is going to matter. His aircraft was a modified RB-29, a reconnaissance variant of the Super Fortress, fitted with a K-38 aerial camera capable of resolving objects less than 3 feet across from 30,000 feet. This wasn't a tourist with a Kodak. This was military-grade optics operated by a trained observer. Adams flew his assigned corridor, and then something on the ground made him break protocol. He banked the aircraft. He made a second pass. And then a third. He burned through nearly an entire film magazine, 42 frames, before his co-pilot physically put a hand on his shoulder and told him they had to go. When the RB-29 touched down at its home base, there were men waiting on the tarmac who hadn't been there when they left. Not ground crew. Not maintenance. Men in civilian clothes standing next to a military staff car. Adams later told his wife, in a letter she kept hidden for decades, that those men never introduced themselves. They just asked for the camera. What he'd photographed was still inside it. The developed photographs didn't surface publicly for 31 years. When they finally did, not through a government release, but through a retired photo analyst who smuggled copies out in the lining of a briefcase, what people saw was not what they expected. No craft. No lights. No alien geometry. What the photographs showed was a complex. A large, structured, man-made complex sitting in a region of the desert southwest that, according to every official map from that era, contained nothing. Absolutely nothing. Scrubland. Empty federal land. A cartographic void. The complex had roads. Internal roads, laid out in a deliberate grid. Several large rectangular structures, the analyst estimated them at roughly the size of aircraft hangars. And at the center, a circular feature. A perfect circle, approximately 400 feet in diameter, with what appeared to be a raised central structure. Now here's the part that got people's attention. The complex showed no signs of construction. No staging areas. No equipment yards. No dirt berms from excavation. Whatever this was, it appeared to have been built in a way that left almost no external footprint. Either it had been there long enough for the desert to reclaim its edges, or it was built underground first, and what Adams photographed was only what they wanted visible from above. The analyst who leaked the photos, a man named Gerald Foss, said he'd spent 3 years trying to match the location to known facilities. He cross-referenced it against every declassified Air Force installation list from 1945 to 1965. He found nothing. The coordinates placed it inside a block of land administered by an agency that, at the time, also didn't officially exist. Between 1952 and the early 1980s, 3 separate requests were filed under precursor legislation to the Freedom of Information Act asking about the survey flight, about Adams, and about the film. All 3 were denied. The stated reason on each denial was identical, word for word, no records responsive to this request. But here's what they didn't tell you. Captain Jack Adams was quietly retired from active duty 14 months after that flight. He received a full pension. He signed something, his family found the signature page after he died, the rest of the document was gone, and he spent the next 22 years living in a suburb of Tucson, Arizona. Quiet. Ordinary. Never speaking publicly about his military service in any documented way. His co-pilot on that flight, a lieutenant named Raymond Coyle, transferred to a desk assignment in Maryland within 6 weeks of the incident. He died in 1971. His service records, his family later discovered, end abruptly in October 1952. As if someone had gone through the file and removed everything after a certain date. 2 men. 2 careers quietly redirected. 0 official acknowledgement that the flight, or what it found, ever happened. And then, 30 years later, someone finally blinked. But before we get to what they actually said, you need to understand something even stranger about the land itself. The coordinates Gerald Foss identified placed the complex inside what was, in 1952, a federally administered block of approximately 1,200 square miles in the desert southwest. That land had been quietly consolidated between 1947 and 1950 through a series of executive transfers, each one individually unremarkable, each one moving small parcels from one agency to another until the entire block sat under a single administrative umbrella. The agency responsible for that umbrella? The Atomic Energy Commission. Now, before you jump ahead, this isn't a nuclear test site story. The AEC administered land for reasons well beyond weapons testing. Research facilities. Storage installations. Projects that had classification categories that didn't appear in any public-facing document until 1994. What makes the Adams photographs genuinely strange is the circular structure at the center. Because in 1994, when a batch of AEC documents was partially declassified, researchers found a single reference, one line, to a program designated Project Groundwork. The description: Subterranean Resonance Mapping. Circular Array. Southwestern District. Terminated 1958. No further details. No personnel list. No budget line. Just that one sentence, and then nothing. Subterranean resonance mapping. In a perfect 400-foot circle. In a location that officially contained nothing. In 1983. The Air Force issued a statement. Not a press conference. Not a declassification. A statement. 2 paragraphs, buried inside a larger document responding to congressional inquiries about historical reconnaissance programs. And in those 2 paragraphs, they acknowledged, for the first time, that a survey flight in 1952 had captured images of, quote, an experimental ground installation associated with early-phase electromagnetic research. Electromagnetic research. That was it. No location. No program name. No explanation of why the film was confiscated, why the personnel were reassigned, or why 30 years of records requests have been answered with silence. But here's where it lands hard. 3 independent researchers, working separately in the 1980s and 1990s, cross-referenced the Adams flight path, the AEC land consolidation records, the Project Groundwork reference, and declassified satellite imagery from 1960, the first year American reconnaissance satellites were operational. The 1960 satellite image of those coordinates shows nothing. Flat desert. No structures. No roads. No circular array. 8 years after Adams photographed a complex that took 42 frames to document, the ground looked like it had never been touched. You don't dismantle something that size without leaving marks. You don't erase roads from desert terrain in under a decade without extraordinary effort. Whatever Project Groundwork was, it wasn't just terminated in 1958. It was removed. Here's the thing about the 1950s that most history glosses over. It wasn't just the Cold War. It was the era of American institutional secrecy at its most absolute. The apparatus that had been built to win World War II, the compartmentalized research programs, the black budget frameworks, the culture of need to know, didn't wind down after 1945. It expanded. It became the default operating mode for an entire class of government programs that existed outside normal oversight. Captain Adams photographed something that sat inside that apparatus. Not extraterrestrial. Not supernatural. Something arguably stranger, a large, sophisticated, deliberately hidden American installation that was built, operated, and erased within a single decade, and that the government acknowledged only in the vaguest possible terms, 30 years later, when most of the people who might have pressed for details were already dead. The explanation they gave, electromagnetic research, is almost certainly true in the narrowest technical sense. It just explains nothing. It's the kind of answer designed not to satisfy curiosity but to close a file. To give journalists and researchers a single phrase they can write down and walk away with. And for most people, it worked. But Gerald Foss never walked away. He died in 2001, still filing requests, still cross-referencing documents. His daughter donated his research files to a university archive in 2009. Those files have never been digitized. They sit in acid-free boxes in a climate-controlled room. Available to any researcher who flies out and requests access in person. Nobody has. The photograph exists. The flight record, partial as it is, exists. The one-line reference to Project Groundwork exists. What doesn't exist is the full story. And in the gap between what was documented and what was explained, something was buried. Whether it was mundane and classified or something that genuinely couldn't be made public in 1952, that question has never been answered. Because the people who could answer it made sure the file stayed thin, the language stayed vague, and the curious stayed just confused enough to eventually stop asking. You now know more about this than most people ever will. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. Next time, a Cold War-era submarine was reported overdue, then found, but the Navy's explanation for what happened to the crew was quietly revised 4 times before they stopped issuing statements altogether.